Thank you very much for joining us on this rather nefarious evening. I'm sure you'll all remember where you were when President Trump was elected. I will ask you at this point to turn your phones off. Normally I do that as a courtesy to the speakers so your phones don't go off in the middle of their presentations, but I'll also do it so that you're not tempted to check your Twitter and news feeds for updates during the night. So this is the last lecture for our year-long seminar series, and it's been a fantastic year. Many of you are familiar faces, and thank you very much for your continued attendance during the year. Some of you are new faces, and welcome to you. Most of our lectures, as you will be aware, are focused on diseases and illnesses of the brain, and this is a very important part of our work, and we obviously are doing our utmost to address those diseases and illnesses. But tonight we thought we'd present to you some good news, even though Trump is getting in, about brain health and brain wellness, how to keep your brain healthy as you go on through your life's journey. So our main speaker this evening will be Professor Tony Hannan, and I have some notes here about Professor Hannan's esteemed career. He did his undergraduate and PhD training in Sydney, but we won't hold that against him. And after a very successful PhD, he moved to Oxford University and did very well there, obviously because he was recruited back to Australia on a career development fellowship with the NHMRC, and was subsequently awarded a very prestigious ARC Future Fellowship. These are very hard to get, as Tony will attest to. He is currently the editor of many scientific neurobiological journals, and he and his colleagues, amongst other achievements, and I won't steal his thunder tonight, but provided the first demonstration that environmental enrichment actually does help ameliorate disease processes of the brain, and he will go into that in detail during his talk. Our other two guests are a couple of rising stars of the Florey. We have Dr. Jess Nithianantharajah. I won't go through their research because they will tell you about that themselves. Just to mention that Jess was awarded last year an international award from the International Society for Neurochemistry, a young lectureship at their international meeting, which is a very prestigious award. And Dr. Scott Ayton, who was awarded just this year the Bethlehem Griffiths Research Foundation Young Researcher of the Year Medal. So these are clearly two rising stars of the Florey, and we look forward to their contributions tonight after Tony Hannan's talk. So please join me in welcoming Tony Hannan to tell you about brain health.
Great. Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I think we've just dropped out again, Tom. So, as Tom mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you tonight about how to improve your brain, and I'll be talking about 3 revolutions that have occurred in science and medical research. Okay, so let's start off. Just to background you, and I know some of you have been to some of these other talks, but the major focus of the Florey Institute is to understand brain disorders in order to develop prevention, treatment, and cure. And keeping in mind that brain and mind disorders, when combined, all of these neurological and psychiatric disorders, the burden of disease, not just mortality, but morbidity, for the sufferers, for their families, for their friends, for their carers, is actually much higher than cancer and heart disease and diabetes, which are major problems. But brain and mind disorders are by far the largest burden, and in many ways the most complex disorders. So I'm sure all of you, if I was to ask people in the audience, just look at this list of brain disorders, and if I could get people to raise their hand, whereas for one of these disorders, whether you or a direct family member or a direct friend is being affected by one of these disorders, I'd ask you to raise your hand. Yeah, and that's the usual response, and it's shocking, but it's true, and therefore this is a very motivating area to be working in. So our research is focused on effectively nature, nurture, and neurology, how genes and environment combine to cause brain disorders. So your delta genome at conception, this deck of genetic cards that you can do nothing about, and that's your genome for life that you carry throughout your life. What you can do something about is what we called a couple of years ago the envirome. The envirome would be your total exposure to environmental factors from conception through to old age. And in fact, other work going on in my group suggests that your envirome starts before conception, that the environmental exposures of your mother and your father actually affect you through what we call transgenerational epigenetics. So Lamarck, if you've heard of Lamarck, who was ridiculed widely, he preceded Darwin, and Darwinian evolution is clearly validated. But there's an element where Lamarck wasn't wrong, that your exposures can change not just the mother, but the father through the sperm into the next generation. And this is the type of research we're interested in. So we focus on a range of brain disorders, including Huntington's disease, where dementia and depression are major problems. I'll speak about that. But we're also interested in many other disorders, including schizophrenia, autism, and Alzheimer's, which is the most common type of dementia. And others at the Florey are working on stroke, and I'm sure Scott and Jess will tell you about some of these disorders later on. So in terms of improving your brain health, what I'm really going to tell you about at the end are 5 major factors that you can think about for your brain health. And in fact, someone at greater risk of a particular brain disorder because of their genomes can also think about these factors. So physical activity, mental activity, stress, diet, and sleep. And they're not everything, but they're 5 major factors that you can think about. Okay, so it all starts here. There's 1.5 kilograms of grey and white matter within your skull, which as far as we know is the most complex entity in the known universe. It's 100 billion neurons connected by trillions of connections, these synapses that connect the neurons, that dictate everything you think, everything you feel, everything you do. And conversely, in a brain disorder, the way thoughts and emotions and movement go wrong. So there's many, many fascinating things about the brain. One of them is the fact that the brain's the only organ that really never stops developing. So one way I think about it is the fact that during development, you have what we could call macro development changes, that very early in development, brain cells are born and they make connections and they form all of these cells in the brain. But rather than like a computer that you set up the computer, you build a computer and it just functions for the rest of your life. The revolution of recent decades is that brain plasticity occurs throughout life, that your experience can actually change the connections in your brain. And hopefully if you remember anything from this lecture, in order to remember things from this lecture, not just functionally, but you've structurally changed your brain. Connections have formed within your brain that have laid down those memories. We can show that there's structural and functional changes in your brain associated with memory formation. Conversely, someone with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia may have problems with this process of forming and refining connections. And so the 2 sides of the one coin, effectively. This dynamic image here is showing how the brain is sculpted through development right into the early 20s. This frontal cortex, a part of the brain that differs most between humans and other primates, continues to change into the early 20s. And so this type of sculpting through experience of the brain, these changes in the frontal cortex may help explain why adolescents and teenagers and even into the early 20s, the behaviour of younger people may be partly the fact that these parts of their brain that control behaviour are maturing even not just in the early years, but right into their early 20s. So we're talking here about a mind machine, as I mentioned, 100 billion neurons and trillions of connections, but it's not static, it's not hardwired for life. Obviously, unfortunately, for neurosurgery, it's not colour-coded, so it's actually a pretty boring shade of grey when you cut open the skull and have a peek at the brain, but it's colour-coded here in terms of major lobes of the cerebral cortex. So people have been thinking about and studying the brain for hundreds of years, And as always, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Now, here's a guy who didn't really get it right. He was really working in the dark, and Franz Joseph Gall was the father of phrenology. And unlike Lamarck, who may have got it partly right, Gall got it completely wrong. So what he had was this idea that you could actually feel someone's skull, and by feeling someone's skull, you could actually work out, you know, what their personality was like, that you could feel these bumps on the skull that reflected how the brain was different. But at least he was thinking about the brain. At least he wasn't, you know, feeling some other part of their anatomy. At least he was feeling their skull, so it was a good start. Clearly I thought this candidate was going to win. When I made this slide, sorry for those who are distressed by this, but you know, this one actually comes from my colleague Emma Burrows. Lent me this slide, and look, I'm as shocked as you are. You know, this is more shocking than Brexit, but there's an ancient curse. May you live in interesting times. I think we're all living in interesting times. So back to the science. So we're talking about 3 revolutions. The first revolution I want to talk about is a revolution of neuroplasticity. So your brain in adulthood is not fixed. It's very dynamic. It responds to the environment, and it can be sculpted by the environment. And therefore, the knowledge that your genome is very important is not, in a sense, meaning you're doomed for a particular disorder. That changes in the environment can delay brain aging, and they can delay disorders of brain aging. And the concept is, if we can use, through precision medicine and personalised medicine, if we can use this revolution, the second revolution I'll talk about is genomics. If we can use the revolution of genomics combined with what we would call enviromics, where you're able to quantify your environmental exposures using new technologies like these wearable technologies like Fitbits. I think these are very powerful technologies where you can quantify your physical activity, and you'll be able to quantify a lot of other aspects of your environmental exposures, and use this information together with understanding brain plasticity in order to, in a personalised way, prevent, treat and cure brain disorders. So brain plasticity, this idea that it's not fixed, that the brain's very responsive to change. And the Florey is actually extremely strong in human brain imaging. There's a 7 Tesla brain magnet next door. This is the most powerful MRI machine for studying the human brain. And we have Florey colleagues who use other techniques whereby you can't see the grey and white matter here, but you can see the fibres, the tracks of axons, of nerve fibres that pass through the brain and transmit information. That's another way of imaging the brain. And even these tracks can change due to experience. Back to the coloured brain here, the idea based on many studies using these brain imaging approaches is that actually changing your experience, you can make changes to your brain that can even be detected with structural MRI, this static image of your brain. And that's how big the changes are. If you can detect them by this type of technique, it shows that they're very substantial changes, including all of these types of activities, but they're not limited, they're just examples. So here's an example of an MRI magnet. As I mentioned, we have this state-of-the-art. It was the first 7 Tesla magnet installed in Australia, the most powerful magnet. And so by inserting someone in here, and there's where the head sits obviously, you can image the brain both structurally and functionally. What I'm going to show you is from colleagues, an old paper from an Oxford group, and what they did was to take Oxford undergraduates, so maybe they're not actually just your average normal controls, but anyway, they were volunteer Oxford students, and what they got them to do, these are all people who'd never juggled before, and so what they got them to do is they split them in half as you do in a controlled scientific study, and they got half of them to learn juggling. They taught them how to juggle. It's quite a difficult task over a number of weeks, so you had half of them who weren't learning to juggle and the other half that were. And so essentially what you're looking at here is the imaging, and I won't go into this, but it's those tracks of fibres, the connections. They saw both changes in the grey matter and the white matter, but this is showing changes in the connections between different parts of the brain that were big enough that they could actually see, they could image these changes occurring following learning to juggle. And interestingly, when they did a later scan, so they learned to juggle and then they stopped juggling for a period, and the changes were still there. The implication is this learning how to juggle led to long-term changes in the brain that stayed there even after these people had stopped juggling. So it's quite a dramatic illustration of that type of experience-dependent brain plasticity. Okay, now on to the second revolution, which is going to change everyone's lives. At this point in time, for around $1,000, we could sequence each of your genomes. This is 3 billion letters of DNA in your genome. Now, at the moment, if we put that onto a credit card-sized device and you handed it to your GP or a specialist, they wouldn't really know what to do with it, except for simple gene mutations like Huntington's disease, etc. But in 5 or 10 years, that will change. This field is moving exponentially. And so we'll get to the point whereby even for, and I think we're nearly there now, people like Scott are doing work in Alzheimer's disease where you could take these brain imaging techniques and combine them with the genome and neuropsychology, cognitive tests, and a blood test, and probably with 95% accuracy, take a 60-year-old and tell them whether they will or will not develop Alzheimer's by 80. This is where we're heading. So it's not just these simple genetic diseases. This is where the technology leads us, which is a bit scary, but the flip side of this is that the same research, particularly research being done at the Florey, where we have leaders in this field, is actually going to develop new treatments. It is developing new treatments. And so we can identify those who are at risk, and they can have treatments not only that treat symptoms, but hopefully prevent onset. That's the ultimate. Preventative medicine here is the ultimate goal. Okay, I'll give an example from our own research around Huntington's disease. So this is George Huntington. So in 1872, George Huntington first described what's really an extraordinary disorder where there was a family, a grandfather, his father, and he were physicians in the US, and they identified this pattern of inheritance in this family. And the most noticeable thing in Huntington's is this chorea, these writhing dance-like movements that you see in these patients. And they were able to say that it was a dominant disorder. If one of your parents had it, it was like flipping a coin. You were 50% at risk of getting this fatal brain disorder, which is quite shocking for these families. And interestingly, those of you who are interested in folk music may remember Woody Guthrie. It's always good in a science talk to have a picture of, I lost an image here. I had an image of Bob Dylan. Where'd Bob go? So there was, gee, I don't know where Bob's gone. That's strange. So I had an image of Bob Dylan, so Nobel laureate in literature, but he's a Nobel laureate anyway. And this was a song that Bob wrote about his hero. He was drawn into folk music by Woody Guthrie, and I think in light of today's election result, I think these lyrics are more pertinent than ever. The lyrics of Woody Guthrie give you an insight of how horrible it is with this disease. Is people with Huntington's, they would be staggering down the street and people would dismiss them as being drunks because of the way they were walking. It was called originally St. Vitus dance, and these people would be put in circuses so they could entertain other people because they had this brain disorder. So it's extraordinary in many, many ways. It's almost like 3 disorders in one. You get the dementia. It's a different type of dementia than Alzheimer's, but a horrible form of dementia in terms of cognitive problems with thought, but also major psychiatric symptoms. Around half of these patients develop depression. We were able to show that it's actually organic changes in the brain that seem to be driving this, not just the knowledge of the gene mutation. And another extraordinary thing about this disorder is it's caused by a genetic stutter. So you have these letters of DNA in the genome, and 3 of them repeated, CAG, there's 4 letters, and CAG are 3 of them. You repeat them, and it encodes an amino acid called glutamine, so it's a stutter. And so if you don't have a family with Huntington's or a parent with Huntington's, so you'd have about 5 to 34 of these in your Huntington gene. And the only thing that distinguishes you from someone who would die horribly of Huntington's is that they will have around 40 or more of these. So just a handful of extra repeats in a protein that has over 3,000 of these amino acids, in a genome that has 3 billion letters of DNA. So an incredibly fine line between life and death in that type of genetic disorder. Here's the parts of the brain that are affected, the cerebral cortex laying around the outside of the brain that we think gives rise probably to the dementia and the psychiatric symptoms, but also an area called the striatum. And here's the brain at post-mortem. There's a bit like Alzheimer's, you see parts of the brain that have degenerated after this disease has slowly killed these people for over 10 or 20 years. All right, so one of the things that we did was to take a mouse model of Huntington's disease, and this is from a review with Jess Nithianantharajah, he'll talk to you soon. And so we compared mice that had the Huntington's gene, and that's why we use mice, is that you can create human gene mutations in the mice and model the disease, understand the disease, test treatments, and then move them into clinical trials. And so we compared mice that had this increased novelty and complexity, which gave them more cognitive stimulation and more physical activity. And so this was done with a former PhD student, Anton van Dellen. And what we found was that those mice, and on this graph, I won't show you many graphs, but on this one, this is bad. They're showing the movement disorder. 100% of these standard Howell's Huntington's mice are showing the movement disorder. But if they were given this environmental enrichment, which is increased cognitive stimulation and physical activity, a dramatic delay in onset of the movement disorder in this mouse model of Huntington's disease. This was the first evidence in any genetic model of a brain disorder that environmental stimulation could be therapeutic. Colleagues followed this up in Alzheimer's disease and showed that Alzheimer's mice had dementia delayed by increased cognitive stimulation and physical activity. And people in the fields of Alzheimer's disease and dementia have done human studies showing that cognitive stimulation and physical activity has beneficial effects in delaying onset. It's not a cure, it delays onset, we think is what's happening here. So we can study mice, they're mammals, and their genomes are actually surprisingly similar to ours, and we can get them to do surprisingly complex tasks. And I'm going to show you a video from Emma Burrows, and Jess Nithianantharajah has also pioneered this field of touchscreen testing of these mice. So you can see in this video, up here, there's effectively an iPad or a tablet, so it's directly equivalent of human neuropsychology, where the neuropsychologist would give you a tablet, iPad-type device, and you'd be given tests, cognitive tests, and you'd solve them. So you'd use your finger, so you're going to see the mice use its nose to touch on the screen. If you see here, if you're watching the mouse, it touches on the screen, it gets a strawberry milkshake reward. They love strawberry milkshake, and they'll work very hard for this reward here. And if you see the mouse on the right, it will touch its nose when the stimulus comes up on the screen. So it gets it wrong, gets the answer wrong. There's a light and a noise, and it knows it's wrong, so it doesn't even look for the strawberry milkshake reward. Emma actually gave me another video that I have here. So essentially, this shows you a more complex task sped up in these mice. I hope this plays. There we go. So you can see, you know, okay, it's fast motion, but you can see that they can do very complex tasks. These are more complex cognitive tasks, where it's not just a choice between two stimuli. They have to do more complex tasks that get at memory and learning. They get at attention, at what we call executive function, higher control of the cognitive function. And there's direct analogies to the type of tests that are run on patients with Alzheimer's disease, but not just patients. There's a process that precedes Alzheimer's that's called mild cognitive impairment. So the idea that this is a continuum, and people who are memory complainers, some of them will be on the path to Alzheimer's, some of them not. And the type of research that's going on at the Florey is trying to work out who's at greatest risk. And not only how do we treat people once they've got Alzheimer's, how do we prevent onset? How do we delay onset? These are the type of challenges that we're focused on here at the Florey. Okay, here's another in the Huntington's work. This is work by Jess, and so Jess was able to show effectively with, I won't go into this maze, but effectively in this other test of cognition and dementia in the HD mice, that this environmental enrichment delayed onset of this cognitive deficit modelling dementia in the Huntington's mice. All right, but going from this environmental enrichment, cognitive stimulation, physical activity, we wanted to ask questions around how just physical activity alone has beneficial effects. And Terence Pung and Thibaut Renoir and others have followed this up to show that just physical activity alone in these Huntington's mice delays onset of the movement disorder, of the dementia, and of the depression which we modelled in these mice. The overall results suggest that the combination of cognitive stimulation and physical activity has a greater benefit than just physical activity alone. That's what this research tells us. We've then wanted to drill into the brains because we want to understand mechanisms that cause a disease, mechanisms by which cognitive stimulation and physical activity are beneficial, and we have to look into the brain at areas like the hippocampus, which is implicated in dementia and Huntington's disease, but also Alzheimer's type dementia and various other disorders like schizophrenia. So there are pockets within your adult brain, this is part of the neuroplasticity, there are stem cells residing in your brain that can generate new neurons throughout your life. And so these stem cells and this what we call neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons in the adult brain, can be affected by things like cognitive stimulation and physical activity. And so we think that's one of the ways that this cognitive stimulation, physical activity has therapeutic effects. The other way, I was talking about 100 billion neurons with trillions of connections. It's quite beautiful. It's hard to look at these neurons in the brain without seeing it as almost a beautiful artwork. So you can see why those of us who are in neuroscience actually dedicate our lives to this field. It's not only a noble profession, but it's actually an extraordinary, exciting and challenging profession. So here's individual neurons with connections, these synapses or connections. There's trillions of these in the brain, and they're really important for things like learning and memory, the connections between them, and conversely, the failure of memory, forms of dementia. We know that this cognitive stimulation and physical activity can change the structure of these beautiful neurons within the brain and change synapses, change the connections between them. Here's a dramatic example where here's a single process from a single neuron. Imagine one of these processes from a single neuron, and here's what's called spines. They're part of the synapses, the connections between neurons. And more of them formed in mice that had environmental enrichment, increased cognitive stimulation and physical activity. So here's the type of things that physical activity can do to the brain. It can cause the release of growth factors that are good for the brain. It can improve cognitive performance, including learning and memory. And this may act in many ways. It may act in some ways through the muscles, that physical activity can cause release of what we call myokines, these factors from the muscles that travel up through the bloodstream into your brain. Physical activity can improve the immune system, metabolism. So the brain's in constant crosstalk with the body. So things like physical activity and a healthy diet that help your body, it also are beneficial for your brain. Okay, the third and final revolution I'll talk about is epigenetics. So epigenetics really refers to above the genome. So these 3 billion letters of DNA that you have, even though you've dealt this deck of cards at conception, that control the sequence of letters, chemical modifications can occur that control which genes are turned on and off. So there's two analogies that explain epigenetics. So the first analogy, think about the 3 billion letters of DNA encoding the encyclopedia of your genome. So you've got about 25,000 words in that encyclopedia, and the epigenetics is like underline or bold or italics. It's like a whole bunch of different coloured fluorescent highlighters that decide which genes are turned on or off in every cell in your body. The other analogy, which I quite like, is that of an orchestra. So think of the genome and these genes as the musical instruments. Think of epigenetics as the musicians. And together, through epigenetics, they create the symphony of life. So brain reserve is this term which really gets at the way cognitive stimulation, physical activity may be beneficial. So we think of, by staying physically active and mentally stimulated, you may build up a reserve in your brain. And we're trying to understand how that occurs at the level of molecules, at the level of cells, and at a level of these systems, these networks that dictate cognition and emotion and even movement that's generated by your brain. So the prediction here is that we'll increasingly apply this neuroscience and the beneficial effects of mental and physical activity. And it was proposed a dozen years ago now, the idea of environmemetics. We could use this neuroscience to actually develop new therapeutic approaches that mimic and or enhance the beneficial effects of cognitive stimulation, physical activity. So you all need to do these things, but for some people with essentially a big genetic load for a particular disorder, we're going to need drugs or other therapeutics as well. We're going to need both, is the idea. So, like everything in science, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. There's rarely such thing as a completely new idea. Hippocrates, a Greek philosopher who was the father of medicine, he had something to say about this type of brain plasticity, although he didn't really understand anything about the brain. And Darwin, one of the great geniuses of science, in his autobiography back in 1887, really understood this. I recommend, if you get the time, actually read Darwin's work, not just The Origin of the Species, but the expression of emotions in man and animals. He was a genius, and he was 100 years ahead of his time. So it's an extraordinary puzzle, understanding brain development, brain function, and brain disorders, but one that we're actively engaged in here at the Florey. So here's the take-home messages. The 5 factors, if you want to remember this. Physical activity. My public health colleagues now tell me that sitting is the new smoking. So it's not just exercise. Think about incidental activity. I take public transport, so that forces me to do a certain amount of physical activity each day. I try and take the stairs whenever I can. So building physical activity into your daily routine is not a bad thing. Brain training, it doesn't actually require you to purchase software or hardware. There's 100 different ways this can be done. The idea that learning shouldn't stop at school or university. Why not continue learning throughout your life? Why should it stop then? It should be an ongoing process. And people ask, what should I do? The thing is, it's not enough to do something for days or weeks. If you want a cognitively stimulating activity, complex mental activity, it needs to be something you enjoy enough to do for months, for years, for decades. So it's a very personal choice. The NHMRC and others have generated guidelines for a healthy diet that I don't need to tell you about. Stress is a difficult one. High levels of chronic stress are bad for the body and bad for the brain, but those who engage in the other 4 tips may actually be able to reduce their chronic stress as well. Some people like mindfulness. It's a very personal issue. And a lot of people ignore sleep, which is extremely important. The idea that maintaining healthy sleep patterns and circadian rhythms is so important. So being a big fan of Darwin, and I see in biology everything we understand needs to be seen through the lens of evolution. So what we have here, allowing that our genomes evolve extremely slowly over hundreds or thousands of years, is the fact that we're sitting here with hunter-gatherer caveman genomes and bodies and brains engaging in the 21st century. So our ancestors, when the sun went down, the lights were out. That's what our circadian rhythms are geared to. And so it's the same with a healthy diet. It's a very natural diet. It's the same with physical activity. If you weren't physically active, you died. If you didn't hunt and gather as a group, you died. So a lot of this advice is just getting back to the basics in terms of what Homo sapiens have evolved to do. And a lot of environmental problems in modern society are effectively a maladaptation. So here they are. Look, I thought Hillary was going to win. I thought, you know, it's crazy times we live in, but fortunately we're in Melbourne. And so these are, I've left sleep off here. Tom kindly shared these slides. So I'd like to acknowledge these wonderful people, past and present, from my team at the Florey. And I think we're going to take questions as a panel. So I think I'm going to now hand over to Jess and then Scott. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Tony. So yeah, we'll have Scott and Jess come up to the stage, please. Yeah, just have a seat. Be comfortable. I'll just turn the lights on so people can see you. No, they're doing that themselves. Oops. Right, people can see you now. So Jess and Scott are going to introduce themselves much better than I ever could, and maybe give a 5-minute overview of the research that you're currently doing at the Florey.
Oh, I'll take this one. It is on. Fabulous. All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I just wanted to take a few moments to tell you a little bit about the work that I'm currently involved in, which has many overlaps with the work that Tony's just spoken about. And ultimately, what I'm really looking forward to is actually engaging in some discussion with you all. So I lead a research team at the Florey that's really focused on understanding how the brain processes information about the environment, and in particular how the connections in the brain that Tony alluded to, these synapses, how they're really fundamental for how the brain ultimately encodes information about the world. And we know that these synapses are important ultimately for controlling complex cognitive and mental processes. So they are actually really key. There are many things in the brain, it's fascinating, but these connections are ultimately really fundamental for normal brain functioning. So as I mentioned, extending some of the work that Tony's already introduced, one of the key outcome measures that we've detected when you have this sort of enhanced mental and physical activity is actually you increase the connections in your brain. And it's this increase in these connections that actually correlates very strongly with how well you perform on various tests of learning and memory. So I think this also touches back on the concept of brain reserve that Tony introduced, which is it's likely that it's actually the connections in your brain that are really essential for this idea of cognitive reserve. And that the more that you stimulate and challenge the brain to grow and strengthen its connections, the more resilience that you may actually have further down the track when you're faced with when those connections don't necessarily work as well, such as what happens during ageing and in disease. So one of the other things that I wanted to share with you about what we know about these connections in the brain is that work that's particularly been driven within the last 10 years has really highlighted this evolutionary significance of these connections, or the proteins or the building blocks that are required to make these connections. And that is that we've discovered that over time and across the evolution of species, that the number of these building blocks is actually what has significantly evolved and increased in humans, suggesting that it's actually this complexity that's actually helping us as humans be able to perform many complex functions, and how is it that we as humans can juggle these multiple complex functions in comparison to more simpler organisms, for example. So these building blocks that are required for forming these connections in the brain are essential for essentially dictating how well those connections are. So a key focus of the work that I'm currently driving is really to understand how these building blocks or the connections regulate complex behaviour, which is obviously essential for how we navigate through everyday life, and how we can ultimately strengthen those connections. So what I'm really looking forward to is actually opening up some of these discussions on how is it that we effectively build connections in our brain.
Thanks very much, Jess. My name is Scott Ayton. I work here at the Florey. I thought the best way to introduce myself is to introduce the work that I'm involved in and Alzheimer's disease. So I am a researcher looking at the clinical progression of Alzheimer's disease. Just before I get going, thanks all for coming. We're at the Florey, we love to talk about the brain. We're very passionate about it, so it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to chat with you all. So look forward to discussions. So what we've now come to understand in this recent period is that Alzheimer's disease is a very slow progressing disease. This is work that actually came out of the Florey. This is what we call the natural history of Alzheimer's disease, where I've just turned it off. Anyway, you can get the point that, here we go, that Alzheimer's disease emerges over decades. So when someone presents with symptoms of the disease, the actual disease has been occurring for even decades before they present to the doctor. This is a really startling revelation. And what my interest is really what's happening in this period here, before someone gets Alzheimer's disease. I want to be able to understand, how can we predict who's going to get Alzheimer's disease in the future? And if so, how can we treat those individuals from preventing them from ever getting Alzheimer's disease? Now, given that this is a disease that takes many years to emerge, it's best that we treat or prevent Alzheimer's disease at this stage and not at this stage where someone presents with the symptoms. It would be similar to if you're experiencing a heart attack, that you'd start your exercise routine or you'd go to the doctor for anti-cholesterol therapy. That's way too late in the disease process to start changing your behaviour. This is the foundation for a heart attack began decades earlier, and this is what we now know is true for Alzheimer's disease. While Alzheimer's disease presents maybe when you're in the 80s, the genesis of this disease began in the midlife. And so what we now know is that there are some prominent risk factors for Alzheimer's disease later in life that if we do well to control, we might actually prevent cases of Alzheimer's disease from occurring. One of those things is hypertension. We know that midlife hypertension is one of the most prominent risk factors for developing Alzheimer's disease later in life. And we heard Tony speak of many other risk factors, such as a lack of exercise or poor diet that could be contributing to the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So really it's an investment in the decades before Alzheimer's disease emerges, an investment in your health at that time, in your brain health in that time, will put you in the best position to delay or stave off Alzheimer's disease. But at the Florey, we're also very interested in treating Alzheimer's disease as well. And you'd be surprised to know that the Florey is one of the single largest sites for Alzheimer's disease drug therapy trials. And indeed, we're starting out our own new clinical trials. Work that's come directly out of the Florey has started another clinical trial next year for Alzheimer's disease. And we've got great hope that we will be able to treat this disease in the future. But better than treatment of a disease is to prevent it. And this is why it's so important to invest in the brain health in this period before the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease emerge. So that's what I've got to say, and I'm happy to chat about that if you have any questions.
So we'll open up the floor to questions, and we've got a long time into other lectures. So is anyone going to kick us off with a question?
Myself, I think there is hope, even if you haven't exercised through the early stages of your life or in your life. I still believe that we can, with the right exercise, if you like, change things to a degree. No no matter what stage of life you're at. And I read that it's quite difficult as you get into senior years to actually initiate an exercise program. And I just want to put in a little bit of marketing, if you like. I'm not a paid employee, but for places like the City Gym, who run a program for seniors, which I'm totally gobsmacked by when I see some of the senior people in that group. So I strongly recommend seniors, please give it a go. Go to the city baths or to Carlton baths, where they have got an exercise program for seniors. Get in there and get started, and you know, give it a go, because it's not too late. There's still hope.
I completely agree. It's never too late to begin exercise, and it'll be helpful regardless.
Actually, can I make an additional point to that? I think this touches on a point that Tony also raised, which is the critical thing that plasticity in the brain and the body is something that we now know is available to us or open to us throughout life. And so absolutely, you've just raised this idea that it's never too late to participate in physical exercise. But the other key factor, which we know from many animal studies as well, it's a combination. It's just not one or the other. So back to mental, being, to actually challenge yourself and mental stimulation is actually quite key. And we'll touch on this maybe as we go along. One of the key things we know about a lot of people would say to me, but we already lead very diverse lives. We're mentally stimulated all the time. But the reality, I think, is that as humans, we're actually very habitual creatures. We partake in certain activities and we may repeat those, but I think Tony pointed this out. One of the things we know from our research is the key is actually about diversity. So it's a little bit like, it's not about just doing one, it's not about doing Sudoku and then doing that all the time. You've actually got to train your brain and challenge them on various different types of activities, and it's that change that's actually really, really key for the plasticity.
Yeah, I'd just like to know a little bit more about the clinical trials that you spoke about at the end of your discussion. What are the precursors to be involved in the trials, and are they using medication or are they using other forms of treatment?
Sure. So there are several clinical trials going on. What I was referring to is drug treatment clinical trials. Now, the inclusion criteria for those vary widely depending on what clinical trial we're talking about, but usually people have to have evidence of the disease within their brain, so you usually have to have a scan, and also the onset of clinical symptoms of dementia. And so, but there's additional criteria that you can be involved in, and you can, I can't tell you the website to apply to, but there's ways to access that. If you can get in contact with me later, I can point you towards that.
I can add something that we can just, if you Google A4 or just search on our website A4, that's one of the trials.
Yep.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm just wondering about sleep patterns. There seems to be widely varying advice about what should and shouldn't be. You should be sleeping this or you shouldn't be sleeping that. I'd like to know a little bit more about what you think is a healthy sleep cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, a good question. I'm not a sleep scientist. We actually had a US sleep expert give us a seminar. The advantage of the Florey is that we have a lot of world experts come through here every week, and she gave a lovely talk and talked about data. She actually had a graph, and in later old age, the sleep tends to go down, and children and adolescents need more. I've heard numbers, 10, 12 hours. The standard amount that's claimed is 8 hours. And I think rather than this just being, that you're a bit sleepy and grumpy, the debate amongst neurologists and psychiatrists is, does the brain disorder disrupt sleep and circadian rhythms, or does disruption of sleep trigger in someone who's genetically susceptible? Does it trigger a disorder? And I've heard psychiatrists working in bipolar disorder and depression debate this in terms of whether disrupted sleep. And clearly a lot of this is about maladaptation. So all of these screens that everyone looks at now, screens emit blue light. So it's actually the light into your eyes at particular wavelengths, like blue light, can actually set, it tells your body that the sun's still up. And so it shifts rhythms. It's just like jet lag without flying. And so it's increasingly realised, not just for you to have optimal cognitive function every day, but in some, I've heard it claimed by neurologists and some people with mild cognitive problems in later years, that some of it is their sleep, and in some cases that can be the brain disorder. The brain can actually affect, there are parts of the brain that control circadian rhythms and sleep patterns, and sometimes it's actually the degeneration that disrupts sleep, and sometimes it's just that people aren't managing their lifestyle properly, and then that exacerbates their cognitive problems. So it's a very complex area, but there are, I think none of us are experts, and there are health guidelines, and the common target you hear is 8 hours sleep, but there may be more. I think the NHMRC, it's federally funded, has guidelines on various lifestyle factors like that are evidence-based. I think that's a critical thing here, that everything you look for has an evidence base, because we know there's a lot of nonsense on the internet.
I might just add to that, if anyone here in the room enjoys getting out into the bush and going bushwalking or camping, it's very quickly you snap back into that, go to bed at dark, wake up with the sun. It only takes 2 days, day and a half.
So this US professor said, if you want to know what your proper cycle is, throw away your alarm clock. Don't use an alarm clock. People who are sleeping adequately don't use an alarm clock. If you need an alarm clock to wake you up, then you're not getting enough sleep. That was what she said here last week.
Craig.
Thanks, Tom. Just on that last set of conversations, I see a lot of, let me say, 30s, 40s-year-old folk in the workforce that are making a choice between exercise and or sleep. So busy people, young families, and the male or the female may get up at 5 in the morning to do an hour's exercise. So question is it better to take the extra hour's sleep for brain health or do the exercise?
Wow, that's a dilemma. I guess some of this some of that gets back to stress. If you've got a sufficiently demanding job, and I can relate to this in terms of trying to juggle a demanding job and a family and these type of factors, and my colleagues too, it's difficult, and people have to make choices. And I guess on an individual basis, you need to judge whether that amount of sleep, whether you're actually functioning well, and is your benefit from that exercise outweighing that. So I guess individuals have to make that judgment. But there's always the case, if you're getting up at 5 and the problem is that you're going to bed at midnight, do you really have to go to bed at midnight? I guess everyone has lifestyle choices, and everyone says, and in these days of social media, do you need that hour on Facebook? Are there other parts of your lifestyle that you maybe could deprioritise?
And I wonder, Craig, if you'd prefer your employees to build sleep into their day or to build exercise into their day. Yep, I think so. In terms of being at work and doing something else. Anybody else? Up the back here.
I'm interested in sitting is the new smoking, particularly as my father had Alzheimer's and spent an inordinate amount of time sitting down. So the problem is I find that I rush around all day, and then when I get to the evening, I just can't keep rushing around. I do try and move once an hour, but I do have to sit down, and it's very convenient to sit down in front of the television and eat your meal sometimes. So I'm wondering whether you've got any extra tips, like should I be reading or should I be watching Catalyst rather than some other rubbish on the television to keep my brain stimulated while I actually have to physically sit down?
I think you should be looking at the Florey website. So, look, that's what I always, since we first published this, I get the question, what exactly should I be doing? And I think the important thing is you need to enjoy it. All of these public health studies are done on averages across the population. And so there is no magic formula. I guess people who watch enormous amounts of television, let's face it, Australian commercial television, most of it's not terribly cognitively stimulating. And it's a double whammy. You're sedentary and perhaps, but for some people it's a de-stressor. Some people, and documentaries can be very stimulating. So there's no formula, but I think it's the whole package, and that a lot of people, they get up, they hop in their car, they drive to their office, they sit in a chair for 8 or more hours, they hop in their car, they go home, they sit on the sofa. And the suggestion is that then doing a lot of gym work on the weekend may not totally compensate for that. So there are guidelines, and I think it's like a lot of other guidelines, you have to make that personal choice in terms of what you want to do with your lifestyle and your life. And like all of this, we need more research. We don't actually, we haven't done enough research to know what the key factors are. And I think ultimately some of it will be tailored to your genome. People who are, maybe your father had certain risk factors, and it may have been environmental, the major risk factors, and in the future we may be able to, as Scott said, we can identify those at greatest risk, identify them early. And this other point, it's never too late. It's like stopping smoking. It's never too late to improve your lifestyle. I think whenever you start an improved lifestyle, that there's always potential benefit there. But you certainly shouldn't feel guilty about something that's an important part of your lifestyle. I don't think we want public health to just burden people with guilt and anxiety and stress. There should be positive things that actually improve your life. And social interactions, hugely cognitively stimulating. If you're just thinking about just social interaction, is a very stimulating mental activity.
Okay, there's a question up the back here. I think there was.
Sorry, maybe I can just, while we're going to the next question, just add to that. I think it comes back to this, as Tony says, I think everyone is looking for that magic formula. What do I need to do for this amount of time and this amount of time? And it goes back to that point that I made earlier about that diversity. Once we schedule in, this is what I need to do, you're losing what it is that the brain and the body want, which is to keep it flexible and to keep challenging it. So part of it is, whatever your schedule is for the day or a week, whatever the case is, just as long as you're challenging yourself, along the way, and to keep that being, actually be challenging, because the brain, like the body, like anything else, it's like going to the gym. If you just do the same exercise over and over again, it's no longer beneficial. You need to actually change the exercise that you do. So back to the comment when Tony was saying about driving, it's a classic thing. I do this myself. We figure out a path. We're going to go from work to home, and we take that same path. And now with GPSs, you don't even have to think about where you're going. So some of these simple things to just stop and say, well, maybe I'll just walk a different route or whatever. And you'll realise that we're naturally all driven to be habitual, but it's that part that you've got to change. It's just changing up those daily rituals.
You have 3 different research approaches, so 3 separate answers, please. What's your gut feeling? Do you think Alzheimer's is one singular disease, or is it a combination of many that come together?
Perhaps Scott should start there.
Well, there's something called dementia, which is many diseases. And Alzheimer's disease is a disease that fits under that umbrella. So there's vascular dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia, Alzheimer's dementia that fits in amongst all that. When we talk about Alzheimer's disease, we're talking about a pathology that occurs in the brain with in combination with symptoms. And it's actually a disease which is not all that different between individuals. There are differences, but when we talk about many other diseases, there's quite a bit of difference between individuals. But for Alzheimer's disease, that's kind of different. It is pretty similar between individuals. So when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, I'm pretty confident to say that there is a general Alzheimer's disease, which is a single disease, and there is something else called dementia, which is a broad term. There's also young onset dementia, which I would call something different. We call that young onset Alzheimer's disease. But late onset Alzheimer's disease, I would probably say that is a single disease. Yep.
Jess, did you have anything to add to that? Or Tony?
I just wanted to share something that people might already be aware of, but one of the striking things that I find with something like Alzheimer's disease, which, as Scott alluded to, is defined by this pathology in the brain, these tangles and or plaques. But what's fascinating is we know that there are individuals who lead a very cognitively normal life and yet still present with that pathology at the end. It really highlights this idea of how it really is your environment and how your experiences and how that can buffer. And it comes back to this idea of brain reserve. So it's not, just because you have that pathology does not necessarily mean there's going to be cognitive decline, because there is clear evidence that there are individuals who lead very, very healthy and cognitively active lives, but yet present with the same pathology. Again, speaking to what we're talking about, it's about keeping your brain, healthy.
One question in the middle. Might make this the second last and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you. I guess this is directed at Scott. In relation to Alzheimer's, you talked about how the development of the disease can progress over many years before symptoms develop. What's the evidence that you can detect the disease before symptoms developed, either by scans or by some repeatable cognitive testing that will find sort of small reductions in capacity that don't show up, that hasn't reached the stage of typical symptoms?
Sure, thanks for the question. I'll extend upon what Jess says, that we do actually have scans that can detect Alzheimer's disease, the pathology of the disease. And we can, if we approached a population of elderly people, we could detect that in a good number of people. But what we don't know is when will the syndrome of dementia occur. So there's something called Alzheimer's disease, and there's something called the syndrome of dementia that accompanies Alzheimer's disease. So this can take decades to emerge. And this is what my research is focused on at the moment, that while we can detect the evidence of the disease occurring in the brain, we can't yet predict who's going to progress clinically. And that's the focus of my research at the moment. And this is the biggest question for Alzheimer's disease, because if we can identify those individuals, we can select them for early clinical intervention with drugs that we're trialling. And that's the focus of our research.
All right, last question at the back here, and I'm sure our speakers will be happy to stick around after the presentation if anyone's got any burning questions. And I'll just remind everyone that these lectures are recorded, so you can go back to our YouTube channel, which is, the latest lecturer there is Mel, if anyone's interested in Parkinson's disease, and you'll find all of our previous lectures there on the website as well.
Thank you. Apart from medications, is there any supplements you would recommend for brain health and also for people at risk of Alzheimer's?
I will begin. I would say that at the moment, there's not good evidence that any supplements are going to delay or treat Alzheimer's disease. Though the research is, I guess, in its infancy, and we need more research to understand that. You guys want to add anything?
I just wanted to say there's been, a lot of research that's looked at various aspects of, resveratrol, which is what's in red wine, ginkgo biloba, et cetera, and some of these things we know can, enhance cognitive functioning, but I think what's unclear is whether any one of those taken for a set amount of time is actually going to deliver the answer. So it comes back to Tony's main message, I think, about balance, really, and it not really having a single answer for every single person, I think, is really the end, I think, answer to that.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think a lot of this is about evidence, and I feel very strongly on this evening where we have President Trump and we have a lot of, in that election campaigns, there's been a lot of irrational things said. And in this 21st century where we have problems with climate change and we have a lot of medical challenges and we have a lot of other challenges, I think we need a community that's driven by rationality and science and evidence. And one of the challenges for supplements, now the nutritionists, based on evidence, say that those who eat a healthy diet, I showed the NHMRC guidelines around whether it's a Mediterranean, a diet with lots of fruit and vegetables, etc., should get enough basic vitamins and minerals, that they shouldn't need supplements. That's a statement. In terms of drugs, like Scott was talking about, to do a clinical trial costs a lot of money, many millions, sometimes hundreds of millions, to do a clinical trial with a drug versus a placebo in a randomized way that's high-level evidence. Now, the type of companies that sell supplements don't have the money to do those trials, nor the interest, in a way, to do those trials. So those type of high-level evidence is often not generated for supplements. So you can't say in the way you can for a drug that this has actually treated this disease because the equivalent trials haven't been done. And so I'm sure the evidence will, those type of studies will be done, but I think it's always, there's so much on the internet and elsewhere about snake oil and pseudoscience, and it's very hard for the layperson to distinguish. So I think we need bodies like in Australia, the NHMRC, where you can go back, and if it's climate change, the International Panel on Climate Change, I think we need to defer to these large bodies of scientists and medical researchers who actually generated high-level evidence and weigh up that evidence relative to other findings that have less evidence. Of course, if the supplements do no harm, then go for it. But I think this touches on the idea of people changing their lifestyles based on evidence, which is what we've tried to focus on tonight, versus changing a lifestyle because there's a new fad coming out of Hollywood, for example.